see if we can get this on YouTube perhaps, so that other way some others can watch it, which would be great, and I can put it on a link on my webpage, which would be awesome. Of course, on the review sheet, what I want you to be looking at here is where the section says use quadrant analysis on these major stories. So put it on the board here. What are the basic, what's the setting, kind of where and when did the story take place, the plot, the characters, and the theme, or themes of the work, and we'll be talking about those. I want to kind of start this kind of in the order that's on your review sheet, okay? Particularly for right now, in that sequence from top to bottom, going over the stories we haven't covered in class. So, and we have on the back page of this review sheet, it tells you exactly the page numbers that you go to. So, and I will need you guys to turn to the page numbers, and I'll just do some talking. At times I might have you read, but otherwise we're going to go pretty well straight through this. So let's start with Stephen Crane. And Crane wrote the short story An Episode of War on page 474. So when you turn there at 474 and you get some background on him, let's talk about essential information with him. The big thing is that you can see he didn't live very long. His dates were 1871 to 1900, and so 29 years, and then died unexpectedly, really, of tuberculosis, officially at age 28 when that happened. Stephen Crane had not even been born. This is what it reads: when the last battle of the American Civil War was fought. He's best remembered for his compelling depiction of the conflict. During his brief life, Crane worked to establish himself as both a leader of the naturalist movement and one of the great writers of his time. And like I said, the most significant novel, Maggie, A Girl of the Street, he published in 1893, important work, and it is very graphic. But then a second novel was Red Badge of Courage, published in 1895, and that's what the one he's most famous for. And we're going to get a sense in this story, An Episode of War, what he does with naturalism and French Impressionism as two techniques. Okay. In the background on page 476, it says, when the war began, neither side was prepared to care for the wounded. The conditions were terrible. There was twice as many Civil War soldiers who died of infections as of combat wounds. As you read An Episode of War, keep in mind that amputation was routinely treatment for injured limbs. A wounded soldier that he faced had a high probability of losing his arm or leg to a surgeon's saw. It's kind of interesting. In the back of the story, you can see a picture here on page 480, and that would be what would it be in a Civil War surgeon's kit. Just basically, it almost looks like hammer and chisel and a saw, and that's where if you were wounded because of the possibility of gangrene infection, you're going to get amputated for that if you get killed in a limb, shot in a limb. Okay. The start of this story, on page 477, the reason I call this French Impressionism is because we'll never know a character's name in here. It'll talk about the lieutenant, who's the main character of the story. He's just known as Lieutenant. We don't know what battle it is. A lot of people say this has been the Battle of Manassas. So it's just a guess. We don't know. He doesn't say that because he wants to give you the impression that you were in war. And what would happen, particularly with the medical tents and after somebody got injured. So at the start of this story, the lieutenant, and again, I don't even know whether this is the North, the Union Army, or the South. I'm guessing the Union Army, but not sure. This lieutenant has taken his sword out of its sheath, and he has thrown coffee down on a rubber blanket. And what he's carefully doing is dividing all of the grounds of coffee into little squares. The lieutenant's going to have a man from every one of his divisions or troops will come in there representing them, the corporals, and they will take a square of that coffee back to where their campfire is, and each little division or smaller unit is going to have a cup of coffee for that morning. This is a ritual that's done. And as he's doing this, the guy's wincing and he's like stung. And we start realizing he's been injured in his right arm in a battle, and he can't use it anymore, and he's right-handed. So he's actually trying to divide this with his left hand. It says here the officer had, of course, been compelled to take, this is page 477, the officer had, of course, been compelled to take his sword into his left hand. He didn't hold it by the hilt, he grabbed it at the middle of the blade. So here he is holding the middle of the blade, carving out those little squares of coffee. Finally, he's done with that, and everybody gets their coffee and goes back to their campfires and makes coffee for the morning. Now it says he's going to try to put his sword back in its sheath or its holder. Finally, he tried to sheath the sword held by the left hand at the middle of the blade in a scabbard hung at the left tip, so he's doing it here on this side, is a feat worthy of a sawdust ring. This wounded officer engaged in a desperate struggle, the sword and the wobbling scabbard, and he finally is able to put his sword back in the sheath. There are going to be people in the camp that will see, hey, buddy, you're injured. You need to forget getting close to the front lines anymore, Mr. Lieutenant. You need to go back to where those white tents are. And he's going to continue to kind of get it from the camp, go back towards the white tents, and that's where those are the medical tents. That's where he can get help. But there is this moment, and this is a great example at the bottom of page 478, where you see French Impressionism, just giving you the impression that you were in a real live battle scene. And this is a guy, a 25-year-old is writing about this long after the Civil War, and you get the sense that you're in battle. He writes this paragraph. A battery, a tumultuous and shining mass, was swirling toward the right. The wild thud of hooves, the cries of the riders shouting blame and praise, menace and encouragement, and last, the roar of the wheels, the slant of the glistening guns, brought the lieutenant to an intent pause. The battery swept in curves that stirred the heart. It made halts as dramatic as the crash of a wave on the rocks. And when it fled onward, this aggregation of wheels and levers and motors, and as a beautiful unity, as if it were a missile. The sound of it was a war chorus that reached into the depths of the man's emotion. Loaded in that from the horses and their hoofs and their running and the guns, the eking of the guns as they're being pulled along. All of that is a war chorus. It's the sound imagery that's there is simply amazing. It gives you a sense of this is what you really would have heard and would have been like if you were in wartime. As this thing goes on, let's go to the last two lines of 479. At the roadside, a brigade was making coffee and buzzing with talking like a girls' boarding school. Several officers came out to him and inquired concerning things of which he knew nothing. On seeing his arm, one man began to scold him. Hey, why, man, that's no way to do that. You want to fix that thing? He appropriated the lieutenant's wound. He cut the sleeve and laid bare the arm, every nerve of which softened flutterly under his touch. I mean, this guy's grimacing and he's hurt because he can't use his right arm anymore. And people are kind of putting it in a sling. But he needs a swift medical attention. A couple paragraphs down in the middle of about 480. A busy surgeon was passing near the lieutenant. Good morning, he said with a friendly smile. Then he caught sight of the lieutenant's arm and his face at once changed. Let's have a look at it. He seemed possessed suddenly of a great contempt for the lieutenant. This wound evidently placed the latter on a very low social plane. The daughter cried out impatiently, "What muttonhead had tied it up that way anyhow?" The lieutenant answered, "Oh, man." Okay, this is where the story gets kind of interesting. Pretty much the surgeon knows that he's going to get the saw and he's going to cut his arm off. That's just the way it's done. The lieutenant is going to say, yeah, you can do what you need to do to my arm, but don't cut it off. And so you have these lines at the end of page 480. Nonsense, man, nonsense, cried the doctor. Come on along, I'm not going to amputate it. Come along, don't be a baby. Let go of me, said the lieutenant, holding back wrathfully, his glance fixed upon the door of the old schoolhouse as sinister to him as the portal of death. And this is the story of how the lieutenant lost his arm. When he reached home, his sisters, his mother, his wife sobbed for a long time at the sight of the flat sleeve. Oh, well, he said, standing shamefaced amid these tears. I don't suppose it matters so much as all that. So here the guy was dead against having his arm amputated, but it has to get amputated. And it does, and that would be a casualty of war. This is kind of considered an episode of war as the title of the story. And just telling you about war is hell. And so many people in the Civil War came home with lost limbs, and it's because that was the state-of-the-art medical technology with a saw. Okay? You get something like that. That's the plot of what happened. You get to the theme of it, and your theme's going to be something like war is hell, and people come home injured and traumatized by it all. Whatever you wanted to happen to medically, it doesn't happen. They saw off your arm. All right. The next thing that's listed on your review sheet is swing low, sweet chariot, and go down Moses. And this is going to be page 486 to 490 in your book. It's kind of right after this story. These are considered Negro spirituals. And a helpful thing is the background on these songs, written on page 488. It says Africans first came to this country as slaves in 1619. Slavery continued. In the next paragraph, one of the activists in the Underground Railroad was Harriet Tubman, who was born a slave around 1820. Tubman was called the Moses of her people. In the Bible, as you recall, Moses led the Israelites out of captivity in Egypt. Following Moses' example, Tubman escaped along the Underground Railroad and risked her life to return for her family. And driven by this need, she eventually led 300 more slaves to their freedom. So what would happen during Civil War times? There's things called coded messages. Negroes or the slaves spoke in code, meaning blacks would know what they're saying to each other, but the whites were pretty oblivious to it all. So if you're out in the field and you're picking cotton or whatever, and somebody starts singing, swing low, sweet chariot, coming forth to carry me home, that song's a signal for Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad is in the neighborhood. This is the night you need to make your escape. The chariot, Moses, is coming down, sweeping down into the south, and you need to get on that chariot and head to the north states. The other one, sometimes you'll get, I don't know, it's in here, but another song called Follow the Drinking Gourd. And then we have this other one on page 490, Go Down Moses. Again, if you ever heard Swing Low, Sweet Chariot or Go Down Moses, that means Harriet Tubman's in the area, make your escape. There was also some of the coding. One of the things that a lot of the southern whites didn't realize is that there were safe houses, and there was a way you could escape if you were a slave during the Underground Railroad times. And one of the things they would do is they'd make quilts, massive quilts, and put them on the sides of barns, kind of in the town or in the community where a lot of people go. And each is like, a 2-inch by 2-inch square or whatever. And if somebody was really ever paying attention, like when it's a light yellow square, that means it's probably a field, like a wheat field or a cornfield or something. And then you start looking at this, and this is quarter section. And this map it's actually a map of a quilt, a map of a 30-mile radius around where they live. And how do you, by looking at the map, escape and go north or to this direction or whatever, and find that safe house, somebody that's going to hide you for a while until you get to the next spot to eventually get rescued by Harriet Tubman. Today, if you could ever get your hands on one of these African-American quilts made during the war or pre-still slavery times, or whatever, the 1840s, 1850s, they're worth a ton of money. A lot of them are kind of destroyed by now, but they are actually escape maps. And again, whites had no idea that was going on. But the blacks, this is how they would manage their escapes through the Underground Railroad. And they'd have to memorize the quote. All right. In the next thing we have to go over is an excerpt you have in here from Frederick Douglass called My Bondage and My Freedom, which is page 494 to 502. Frederick Douglass, this wonderful picture of this guy in terms of biographical background. He was born into slavery, but he got out of it, and he eventually becomes an orator, a great speaker. He writes his own autobiography. This is from his autobiography, this passage and stuff that we have. Yeah, it says he was born on a Maryland plantation, but while he was there, he's a lucky slave because Mrs. Auld, who's the mother that runs the household in Baltimore, she teaches him how to read and write, which makes a huge difference in his life. There's a lot of things about the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. That one essay about what's his experience as a slave, it got printed and sent all around the Northeast, particularly in the 1850s and 1860s. Probably the single best slave narrative that really helped convince Abraham Lincoln to free the slaves. It's said about Abraham Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation that it was actually the day before he signed this or wrote it and put it into law. He had a lunch at the White House with Frederick Douglass, and what's suggested is they ate corn chowder at that lunch. If you ever get summer corn chowder at Panera, go eat it. Do it out of the spirit of liking Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass. But Frederick Douglass at that lunch did enough to say, Abraham Lincoln says, this needs to stop. The next day, he signed the Emancipation Proclamation. All right. In this excerpt from what's called My Bondage and My Freedom, Frederick will talk a little bit about his Baltimore experience. He certainly, if you look at this wonderful picture, I love this painting that was done on page 498. You see what's happening here, and this is that people are going by horse-drawn carriages, and you would have maybe a slave sitting in the very far back part of your carriage. You might have slaves that are walking, but everybody else is kind of walking on the roads. But we have slaves on either side of the road. They can't walk on the road where the whites are. And you were considered, if you were a slave, you're considered chattel, C-H-A-T-T-E-L, which just means you're material property. You're not even a human being. And the more chattel you have, the more wealthy your plantation is. He was experiencing that, but he had the good fortune to have Mrs. Auld be somebody that was teaching him how to read and write. Towards the end of this narrative, when I look at page 502, essentially, Frederick Douglass wants to escape slavery, become free. And Mrs. Auld, who's done a wonderful job of taking care of a slave, never can understand this. So we'll read these words. My interests were in a direction opposite to hers, and we both had our private thoughts and plans. She aimed to keep me ignorant, and I resolved to know, although knowledge only increased my discontent. My feelings were not the result of any marked cruelty in the treatment I received. They sprung from the consideration of my being a slave at all. It was slavery, not its mere incidents, that I hated. I had been cheated. I saw through the attempt to keep me in ignorance. The feeding and the clothing me well could not atone for taking my liberty from me. The smiles of my mistress, Mrs. Auld, could not remove the deep sorrow that dwelt in my young bosom. Indeed, these in time came only to deepen my sorrow. She had changed, and the reader will see that I had changed too. We were both victims to the same overshadowing evil. She is the mistress, and I as the slave. I will not censure her harshly. She cannot censure me, for she knows I speak with the truth and have acted in my opposition to slavery, just as she herself would have acted in a reverse of circumstances. Slavery, then, and not having freedom was a deal breaker for Frederick Douglass. Mrs. Auld would never understand why he would escape and get his freedom when she was treating him so nicely. You kind of saw a little bit about this Huck Bennett and Huck's relationship with Jim. And that ultimately Jim wants to be free, and so did Frederick Douglass. And nothing short of that was what was going to be required. And Frederick got his freedom, and he helped convince Lincoln to free the slaves. Message here: slavery's horrible. Slavery needs to be abolished. Frederick Douglass is the leading abolitionist who speaks. Even somebody like Henry David Thoreau is going to listen to Frederick Douglass and be moved by him. He's a great speaker that went all up and down the Northeast and along the coast. Okay. We have read an occurrence on Owl Creek Bridge, and you have an essay associated with that, right? So we're not going to talk about that. Let's go to Abe Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, and you'll find that on page 520 to 522. Speaking of Abe Lincoln, a man of humble origins, Lincoln developed an early interest in politics. I'm on page 520. He served in the Illinois State Legislature and the United States Congress, and he was earned the reputation as the champion of emancipation. In 1858, he ran for the U.S. Senate against Stephen Douglas. Lincoln lost the election, but the debates he had with Douglas brought him national recognition and helped him to win the presidency in 1860. And the one thing I would say about this Gettysburg Address, he's a couple years into, like 1863, we're like 3 years into the war, 2 years into the war. And it's to honor the people that died in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, on both sides. And there was a state senator, I believe from Ohio, this will probably say it in here somewhere, who gave like a 2-hour speech right prior to Abraham Lincoln's speech. Abe delivers his 272-word speech in about 2 minutes. And when it's done, the Ohio State Senator comes up to him and looks at Lincoln and goes, "You said more in your 2 minutes than I said in all 2 hours." So these are loaded words. Great talk. 407 years ago on 522. Our fathers brought forth on this kind of new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated the proposition that all men, probably change that now, all men and women are created equal. Ultimately, this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and the government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. A great speech, one in which he was trying to bring healing and reconciliation between both sides, but ultimately he's there to honor those that had died in the fight for this country. There's also something in here about Robert E. Lee. I'll just mention it. In his letter to his son, if you read that little letter carefully, Robert E. Lee, who's going to be the head of the Confederate Army, says some real interesting things. He says that dividing our nation and not being a unified country would be a colossal mistake. That's the last thing he wanted is a country that's divided. But by the time he's writing this letter to his son, I mean, this is a direct line on page 526. He says these words: "I can anticipate there's no greater calamity, nothing worse for our country than the dissolution of the Union." Robert E. Lee did not want civil war. He did not want to have the nation divided. He's a military guy, but he's an American. But by that time, several of the southern states had already seceded, and he realized that's exactly what's going to happen. The Union will dissolve, and will be a war. Okay. Let's go to Mark Twain's notorious jumping frog of Calaveras County. It's quite a story. There's questions about it. 569. I'm not going to worry so much. I've given you a lot of background on Twain, about him being Samuel Clemens and what Mark Twain meant, marking the depth of the water for a steamboat. So let's turn to page 569, start of the story. Okay. You got to kind of get the players straight a little bit on this story. The notorious jumping frog of Calaveras County. There is a fellow named Simon Wheeler who sits on a porch in some place in the South. Our narrator is a young, Northeastern educated college student. He is convinced by a friend of his, supposedly a friend, that said, go down to the South, to this particular city and locale, or whatever, and go to this particular address and ask to speak to Simon Wheeler. And when you do there, ask him to explain to you who is Leonidas W. Smiley. I mean, there was no money or incentive. Why would you do this? But the college guy goes, okay, I will. So he goes down to this place in the South. We would think Missouri, but who knows? And he finds this Simon Wheeler fellow. And I said, I've been told by a friend I need to ask you about Leonidas W. Smiley. What happens in this story is Simon Wheeler goes, well, I don't know any Leonidas W. Smiley, but I know a guy named Jim Smiley. Let me tell you the story of Jim Smiley. And what we learned is that Simon Wheeler is a big talker. This would be a guy that's a storyteller. He's worse than me. He can go on forever telling a story. And he says, let me tell you about the story of Jim Smiley. Jim Smiley was a guy who loved to bet, loved to wager. He would go as far as if there were two birds sitting on a telephone wire, he would bet money on which one of the bird was going to fly off first. And he would just bet on any time that he could. Jim Smiley, his big thing is he had a frog that he had found that was a jumping frog, a fast jumping frog. And he named him after political statesman of the day, Daniel Webster. And he would bet on this frog all the time. He said, I got the fastest frog in all of Calaveras County. Anybody want to bet me on that? And he would regularly win the bet. You'd have two frogs ready to go. They'd get one from the swamp and one against Daniel Webster, and they'd have some length, and Daniel Webster would jump and win all the time, and Jim Smiley would win lots of money on Daniel Webster. A stranger comes to town in the story, and he hears that Jim Smiley likes to bet. He's got a frog. I understand you got a frog. Oh, I got the best frog ever, Daniel Webster. He can beat any frog in this entire county. And the stranger to the town goes, I'll bet you $100. I think it's actually $40. I'll bet you $40. That would be a lot of money in the 1880s when he's writing it. I'll bet you $40 that I can just, if there's a swamp around here, if somebody would just go to the swamp and just get me a regular sized frog, then my frog from the swamp would beat your Daniel Webster. Oh, I'll take that bet any day. Daniel beat any swamp frog. So Jim Smiley, and he takes quail shot. Takes like the little BBs and bullets that would be in a shotgun shell. Opens up the frog's mouth, and he puts about 5 pounds worth of shotgun shells, little BBs essentially, into Daniel Webster, right down his throat. And he puts him down to where the race is going to begin. They put the swamp frog next to him, and in the story they say, ready, go! The swamp frog goes all the way. Daniel Webster doesn't move 1 inch. And then the swamp frog won the bet or whatever, and immediately the stranger claimed, hey, I gotta catch a plane, I get whatever, catch a boat or something. I'm getting out of here. You owe me $40. Reluctantly, Jim Smiley gives him $40. Darn! I've never seen anything like this. Daniel didn't even move. So finally, the stranger gets out of the picture and he leaves with his $40. And finally, Jim Smiley picks up his frog, knows immediately something's wrong with him because he weighs about 5 pounds heavier than he normally is. And he goes like this, turns him over, and the quail shot just starts pouring out of the frog. And he realized he's been totally duped and conned or whatever in this particular bet. And this takes a long time to hear this story. And so this New York college boy or whatever that's been convinced to go hear Simon Wheeler tell this story on the porch, Simon goes, our narrator finally finishes the story really abruptly. Says, "I gotta go." I goes, "Oh no, I got more stories to tell you." And the guy just, "No, I'm leaving," and he has to kind of in a rude way get off the porch. In some ways, I always think of Simon Wheeler, this guy that tells stories on the porch, is like so much like Mark Twain would have been, a great storyteller, and you're just mesmerized and you hear whatever he has to say. The message, there's a lot of things that could be the theme of a story like this. Certainly one would be don't bet. That always leads to bad things. Don't trust strangers, because the stranger did trick him, and he certainly did trust him. And instead, he kind of poisoned the frog with quail shot. Sometimes if somebody tells you, go listen to a storyteller, you might want to think twice about that, because you could be stranded on a porch for a long time and hear story after story. Okay. These all sound like pretty good stories, right? I wish we'd read them and we could have taken quizzes on them. Just ran out of semester here. Jack London's To Build a Fire. Today, I talked a little bit about Jack London and Stephen Crane, and they are both naturalism writers. Naturalism. Key term, you got to know what it is. Naturalism is when the individual now is going to go out into nature to see what nature is going to teach them. And in the middle of that training or teaching by nature, the powers of nature are going to defeat you. One of the classes, I don't remember which one, but in talking about that story, I kind of shared what the basic story was, which is all of Jack London's stories are all set in the Alaska wilderness in the Yukon. And a guy that sort of knows what he's doing but doesn't know fully the dangers goes out kind of late in the afternoon with his sled dogs, goes over there in the snow and ice, and he gets knocked off of his sled for a little bit. The sled dogs are there. They wait, and he kind of gets up and he puts all of his weight on one foot or whatever, and the foot then just slides like probably ankle deep in just ice water. He was on the edge of a pond when this happened. Not good. Because it's now the sun is going down and it's currently minus 55 degrees. It's 55 below zero Fahrenheit. If he doesn't act immediately and take real quick action in bitter cold temperatures, he's going to die. As it is, he's probably kind of trying to cover up his face, which is almost kind of frostbitten. I mean, he needs to be, with those sled dogs, going the additional 30 minutes and getting to town quickly, or the guy will die if he's frozen to death. So he decides he has to build a fire real quickly to rescue and restore his foot. And he does. He makes the second big, huge mistake of this moment. He builds the fire under this huge spruce tree, and he gets it going, and sure enough, it's blazing, and he's taken his wet boot off and all that, and his socks, and he's able to take his really cold foot, and with heat, get it next to the fire, it's starting to work. He's de-thawing. He's not going to lose the foot and have to get it amputated or whatever. His foot's being restored. Problem is, huge wind comes in. This is the naturalist forces of nature. The wind then shakes the spruce tree and the pine tree or whatever, and all of the snow that's on the branches, goes straight down in one fell swoop and completely extinguishes the fire. Not a chance that fire will continue again. It just got covered up with snow. Now you're in a situation where your foot's currently exposed. You don't have any spare socks apparently, no dry boots. What are you going to do? I think he puts his boot on, but he just starts walking, and now the winds are picking up, and it's 55 going to 65 below. And he can't even feel his hands anymore because he's been so busy with making the fire that he's probably got frostbite on his hands. And he finally just goes out in front of here, bends down to one knee, and he just kind of gives up. He doesn't have enough energy for this moment. And then one of the lead sled dogs the dogs haven't left, and the lead sled dog is completely obedient. The lead dog says, I'm going to stay here until our master gets us going again, and us pulling the sled. Lead dog has enough slack, can get over to where the master is. And at this point, after some period of time has elapsed, those dogs know they need to get into the city real quick or they're going to die. Lead dog smells the man and realizes that smell of this man's now dead. He is not breathing. The dog goes, "Arr!" Really, it scares him. But then the dog realizes and leaves him and says, come on, we'll eventually pull this empty sled back to the city. And they do. And so the dog survived, but the human that didn't realize how much he had risked and what he didn't know about the cold, he died. That's the tragic, terrible ending of this story. To build a fire. If you're going to build a fire, don't build it under a spruce tree filled with snow. Lessons learned here, naturalism. Forces of nature will eventually kill you if you don't know what you're doing. You better be very careful. The film I was trying to remember that I talked about in class today was called Into the Wild with Emil Hirsch, about a guy, similar thing, that had read Jack London, loved him, but he ends up eating some wild berries that he thought were fine, but they were poisonous, and so that's what killed him. A great naturalism kind of story. Okay. Making some progress here. Kate Chopin's Story of an Hour. You know that story. Mrs. Mallard go down the stairs. Darn guy, he's back. Edwin Robinson's Richard Corey seemed to have everything and put a bullet in his head. Edgar Masters, Lucinda Master, and Richard Bone. Those are all from Spoonful River Anthology. Talked in both classes. We've already done Little Catherine's Wagner Matinee. I've talked in both classes with T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of Geoffrey Prufrock. It's really hard to describe what's the theme or the message of that, which is, but there is a theme to Prufrock, which is a few of them that we could talk about. One would be, you need to be somebody that disturbs the universe. Don't just be somebody that's just a little small bit player. We all need to have lives that are exceptional and extraordinary. The idea also of being a loner and alone and not really connected in a relationship with people, that's not a good thing either. That's one of the reasons that's caused him to be so indecisive and so judgmental of others, because apparently that's what he does for a living, is he walks around at night in deserted streets and has way too much time thinking on his hands. Why this story is called The Love Song of Geoffrey Prufrock, for the life of me, I'd never know. I mean, he's just a single guy, a loner, that's deep in thought. And the real strange or interpretation of the story itself is to think of this is the thoughts of a loner while he's kind of laying on a couch talking to a psychiatrist, telling you about his life's journey. And that at the end of the story, human voices wake us, and that before we drown. I mean, that he's thinking even possibly suicidal thoughts at the end on this alone walk the guy's been on. It's kind of the tone of this thing is kind of sad, depressing throughout all of it. And we feel sorry and really pity the guy because he self-recognizes he's just a follower. He doesn't have any leadership skills at all. In terms of lecture notes, I lectured on the Civil War period of literature, and that's again on the website. Talked about extended metaphor, like how the fog is like a cat or like a dog, yellow fog, the smog. And when you extend it, that means here's several specific ways how a pet is like fog or smog. French Impressionism, that's essentially Stephen Crane's episode of War. He's going to make us see, we can see this in whether it's blue uniforms or gray, we don't know, but there's a lieutenant with an arm that's bad, and with his left hand, we can visualize this guy trying carefully with his sword holding it halfway, can I make cuts and equal cuts of coffee grinds to give an equal amount of coffee to each member of my regiment? And then in the end, a surgeon cuts off his arm, because that's what surgeons did in the Civil War. You really get a snippet of what Civil War life was like. And Stephen Crane never even experienced anything in war, but never in a war. But he can really make you think you were in the Civil War. Realism, that talks about almost every writer we had in post-Civil War literature. Naturalism is just going to be associated with Stephen Crane and Jack London. Powers of nature will kill you. There is a place on the test where I'll probably give you, like we did in class, a passage, at least 70 or 80 words. Same thing, you got to count all of the non-standard dialect words and contractions, stuff that were in it, divide that by the total number of words, and give me a percent on whoever the speaker is. Could be Pap, could be Jim again, could be Huck Finn perhaps, which will not be terribly dense, but you'll just do the math on that, tell me, and show me your work again. Write out all the non-standard words, and that's worth like 5 points, and you multiply that times 2, and it's worth probably 10. There were some other terms in here. Irony. There are 3 types. I want to write these notes down. Irony. Here's a definition. You need to know what irony is. Irony is the difference between expectation and reality. There's 3 types. There's verbal, there's situational, and there's dramatic. Start with situation because it's the easiest one to figure out. The difference between expectation and reality in your situation. What if tonight, coming into my room, instead of it being the rows where they are, and me up here and me talking about these stories, what if you'd walked in here and there was a casket in the middle of the room, chairs were moved off to the side, a dozen people dressed in black, including somebody with a veil on, weeping and crying over a dead body that's in the casket. In other words, this room had become a funeral parlor. Well, that would be what we would call situationally ironic, meaning it's quite different than what you would have expected. Reality here would have been quite different than what you expected. That's irony. Okay? And there's verbal irony. When you say something that it's kind of ironic, that the words that you said. So you guys remember Romeo and Juliet. Sometimes puns could be even verbally ironic. There's a moment where Mercutio has been stabbed by Tybalt, and he's on the stairs, and Romeo or somebody says, "So how badly are you hurt?" And his response is, "Oh, well, tomorrow you'll find me a grave man." That's verbally ironic because grave meaning serious and somber, but also, no, that was a mortal wound that just got me here, and I'll be dead by tomorrow. I'll be in the grave. I also like to give the other example between the fight between Mike Tyson and Evander Holyfield. Okay, remember the famous fight. What ends up happening is that Mike Tyson ends up biting off a good portion of the lower ear of Evander Holyfield. Can you imagine on that day when they weighed in as boxers for the prize heavyweight fight, if Evander Holyfield had said, "You want a piece of me? You want a piece of me?" Yeah, because by that night he would have got a piece of it. That would be verbal irony. Okay. Dramatic irony. Dramatic irony is when we, the audience, know something that the reader does not, or that the person on stage does not, or when the characters in the novel don't know. And Romeo and Juliet is a classic example. We're sitting in the audience, and we know that Juliet has just taken a sleeping potion, that she's not dead. But then Romeo comes in on the scene and thinks she is dead, and then he kills himself. Those of you who remember studying the Diary of Anne Frank, if you were watching that as a play being performed and you're in the audience, the Frank family is up one night, like January 1st, whatever, they have a cake and they're celebrating because it looks like it's the end of the war. But we are watching on the first floor, not the second floor where they're hiding. On the first floor, there's a thief that's come into their building or whatever, and is going to steal something, and he's overhearing and realizes that there are Jews being held in the floor above him, and he'll eventually turn them in. And you want to, as an audience member, you want to just yell out, "Get quiet! Don't throw such a party! There's a thief below you!" You know, you can't do that. That's dramatic irony. We, the audience or reader, know something, but the characters on stage, the characters in the book, don't know. We're kind of like Jim, in that by the 5th chapter of Huck Finn, we know that Pap's dead, but Huck isn't going to learn that till, past the 40th chapter. Finally, there's another thing that's in here, which is existentialism. Existentialism is a philosophy, and it is about asking the question, why do we exist? And there's 2 questions, if you are an existential philosopher, that you ask yourself. Who am I, and what am I supposed to do on this earth? And I think there's an argument that in a lot of the characters we're studying, but let's just say particularly Huck Finn and Jim, that they're on an existential journey. They are trying, as they go down the river, to figure out, who am I? Who are they? Certainly in Jim's case, a man that's been a slave his whole life, and he knows he wants to become free. He has a good sense of who he is. He's a family man, and he wants to buy his family back into freedom. And in Huck's case, initially he goes on this journey because he wants to escape his dad, but he's going to learn a lot about himself and why he exists, and that he's got an ethical sense and a conscience, and he's a guy that's trying to do the right thing. And the second question you ask yourself, so what am I supposed to do on this earth? That's what an existentialist does. Jim knows he's got a purpose. Get free, go to the free states in the north, and buy his freedom back for his family. And that becomes a really good question of, what do you think Huck's going to do when he gets back to Missouri? What is Huck Finn's purpose in life? Is he just going to go back to school, live with Widow Douglas, be friends with Jim, go back to his old way of life? Maybe. But I think he's learned enough along the way that he's mature, he could work, he's going to want to have his own sense of freedom because he knows what it is. And I think you'll find him making more and more responsible decisions. I bet he would be somebody that would lean towards helping out in some way, shape, or form, eventually trying to help abolish slavery and not have people treat people abusively. He sees how damaging that is. I think he's a more sensitive guy. On this test, there are this review sheet, tons of vocab words. You'll need to know them. It's a similar drill where I'll pick out probably 15 of these words. They'll be down the left-hand column. And A through Z, you're going to have to figure out which word best matches that vocab word. So look them up. I did tell you on the review sheet, like, what stories those words came out of. I would go in the front of the story where you have bold types of vocab words, look up the bold type vocab word and see what definition it is in the book, because that's what we're going to stick by. And just know it's either that word or something that sounds very close to it. It'll be another synonym, but it'll be that meaning, not some other meaning. So do your vocab, that'll help. This is 75 questions. Third hour, you guys are taking this on the last day, right, on the 21st. And 6th hour, are you guys on Monday the 19th? Yeah. So you'll have 90 full minutes, answer these 75 questions, and then you'll only have 2 essays to write because you're writing one of those essays tomorrow. Any questions? That only took me 50 minutes.
Yeah, the video stopped in the middle, but I got it within 3 words, so we could.
Oh, that's good. Yes, Brooke?
Okay, what is the future recording?
I'm recording this, putting it on YouTube.
Yeah. Good question. You don't need to videotape it. That was the important stuff. Was that 50-minute window?
Fine.
The theme of occurrence on Owl Creek Bridge.
You know that this conversation is being recorded too, right?
One would be, there are logical consequences when anybody, including a civilian, tries to destroy a bridge that's by the enemy in the Civil War. You're probably going to face the consequences. Ambrose Bierce is certainly saying this message. Here's a story that gets so totally underreported about the Civil War. Tons of people, North and South, civilians died because they were trying to take matters in their own hands and influence the outcome of the war. And how many people would have got hanged on a bridge or trying to, again, slow down or defeat the enemy? And that would certainly be one. There are consequences when you try to take matters into your own hands. And you have to take that risk. I think he took the risk, Peyton Farquhar did, but it cost him his life. There's another theme, I think, related to sometimes it's hard to distinguish between reality and a dream. And it requires us looking in a text, to look at the text and look at specifically the diction that's used and find dream-like words. Just like you would with Poe in The Fall of the House of Usher. We've got to see, boy, the imagery that's here, the words that were used. This isn't reality anymore. This is some kind of fantasy. Well, this was just too good to be true. Somehow a hemp rope is going to snap. The guy's going to fall in the water and survive this thing. Yeah, there's too many words that were used. Unconscious, and he awakened ages later. And a lot of clues that no, this is just a dream. So pay attention to the words used and the images used. Try to determine those moments in literature when reality turns into a dream. What other questions do you all have? It's like someone got some Coco. Did they bring that to you, or is that? No, you already had coffee. Question 3, John. Okay, if this works, Jillian's going to try to get this on YouTube, and if she can get a link, she's going to email. My email will be roperj@usd385.com.
I can find it from the website.
Okay, if you send me the link, then I'll copy and paste the link onto my.
It's probably a bit shaky, but I'll try to edit that out.
Okay.
Like it's easy to memorize. When you look through the story, we'll memorize what it says.
You could just watch it while you sleep, and then your brain can subconsciously absorb it.
Talal, did this help to kind of go through these stories and point out, well, here's what happened, and here's the lessons we can learn from these stories?
Yeah, it gives me ideas so that when I review them, it'll be easier.
Good. Sean, any questions for the good of the order? Something you want to talk about? Study. That'll be my advice to you.
Yeah.
It's probably good you were here. You could hear some stuff. Talk to somebody about whatever you missed. You came in a little bit late. So, copy notes, everybody. The people that aren't here, they're just decided disadvantage because they didn't hear that.
It's fine. It'll be on your website.
Let's get out of here.